I'm your host, Brandy Fleck, and this is Human Amplified. We're on a mission to revamp society by amplifying your humanity. This week on the show,
My name is Kevin Clark, and I am from Virginia, Northern Virginia. A lot of times, it's easy to identify the anger, but what's really underneath it. If you don't deal with your feelings, they deal with you. Pain demands to be felt. Even logically, if you take a step back, how can that not hurt you if you hurt someone else? And how can hurting you not hurt someone else? Hopefully, what I would love to see is this more emotionally evolved humanity.
This episode does come with a trigger warning. We do talk for a few minutes about abuse, trauma, being in the throes of addiction, and strong graphic impulses that arose from suppressing strong negative emotions. This could be disturbing to some listeners. This week, we're featuring guest Kevin Clark. He's author of the book The New Prophet and is a certified substance abuse counselor and trauma specialist. On the surface, this episode is about addiction and recovery. Underneath, it's about how suppressing emotions leads to poor health, self-destructive behaviors, and how spiritual awakening can be a turning point. Kevin explains that at one point in active addiction, it felt like he was losing his soul and needed to get it back. He then walks us through the tangible steps he took while being incarcerated to heal and change his path in life. To summarize, the three major points in Kevin's recovery are letting go, having a safe support system, and having a desire to change. These are the things that helped him deal with his emotions, rather than numbing them. We also talk about the social conditioning that led to emotional suppression in the first place for Kevin, trying to avoid feeling weak as a sensitive person, and how he grappled with strong emotions through his childhood, into his addiction, and into his recovery. In recovery, he started learning how to sit with his negative emotions and just be present as a human being, not a human doing, as he says, a sentiment that other Human Amplified guests have expressed difficulty with too. Over the next hour, Kevin gets real about the gamut of emotions he's felt and can deal with now, including sadness, fear, shame, numbing pain, denial, and vulnerability. But also he talks about empathy, letting go of control, overwhelming gratitude, and the importance of being open and flexible to new possibilities. Kevin has hope that we'll be a more emotionally evolved humanity in the future and wants to see that, and I do too. Ultimately, Kevin is an amazing example of embracing emotions that he used to fear so that he could have a different, healthier life, helping others, being with his family, and skateboarding in his spare time. What's really impressive is that when Kevin was at his most lost, he dared to think maybe everything he knew was wrong and accepted help. That's bravery, strength, and emotional evolution if I've ever seen it. Hey guys, as always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your support. If you haven't already subscribed to the Human Amplified podcast, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform of choice. And then leave us a rating and review. You can even go follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all the places at Human Amplified, and leave us a rating and review there. We love to hear from you. We love to know how we're doing and how we've impacted your life. I'm so excited to have you here, and I'm excited about this conversation. I think it's going to be from a perspective that we haven't necessarily heard before. So, Kevin, how are you doing today? And welcome to the show.
I'm doing good. I'm doing great, actually. I feel like I've had a little bit of mental fatigue this week, but, again, like I said, sometimes that's just the nature of the work I'm in, and you kind of take time to recharge and practice some self-care. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. Before we dive in, can you just introduce yourself to our listeners and just tell them who you are and all about what you do?
Yeah, as I've said, my name is Kevin Clark, and my author name is actually my full name, Kevin McNevin Clark. Yes, my middle name rhymes with my first name. It is pretty cool. So that's a good way to find me if you want to look for me online. But I wrote a book and published it in 2020. That was a new experience for me, but something I kind of knew I was going to do for a while. But really, what I'm passionate about, I think, boiled down to three components. It's probably family, helping others and skateboarding. My job, I'm extremely passionate about. I don't know, it's exciting to me. I love learning new things about it. I work in addiction treatment with a specialization in treating trauma because I've kind of learned through treating addiction that you can't really effectively treat addiction unless you at least have some form of trauma informed care.
Okay.
So that's what I do. I work at a treatment center part time that I've helped develop over the last few years. Recovery Unplugged, the Northern Virginia location. And I also started my own counseling business, Excelsior Addiction Services, in 2020 as well. That's me.
Amazing. That's really cool. And hopefully, we'll sort of get into what led you down that path based on what we're going to talk about. But let's just dive in and start with the topic of emotional sensitivity. And you've told me before that you believe that it is a gift. So, why is that?
It's a gift because, and it took me a long, long time to get there with that our capacity to feel deeply. I mean, we know empathy is kind of what connects us as people, and I talk about that in my book where like compassion, I feel, is like a connection to the divine, this understanding born in love. And like, so I don't believe in compassion fatigue 'cause I never run out of that. But empathy, that emotional connection, that's where I kind of have to, you know, sometimes set some boundaries because, when you feel deeply, it can leave you worn out when you are feeling with people and when you're very sensitive. So learning to be with our own emotions and finding out what belongs to us and what we don't have to pick up is part of the learning process. But again, I say it's a gift because if I can understand, emotions in their most amplified presentation or experience, then I can probably help other people through their process. So it just deepens the capacity to connect with one another. I used to have a friend, his mom would say when I was a little kid that I had an artist soul because I just felt like everything so, deeply.
Hmm.
I had big and loud feelings, which were a lot at first, and I didn't like it at all.
Yeah. Do you create any art?
I do. I draw. I drew the cover of the book actually. When my wife was in the hospital, I just drew it one day.
Awesome.
So I draw, and actually, I do draw a lot of the time when there's like heavy emotional stuff going on in my life. I like to doodle like all the time just to kind of like keep that flow open. But I usually only draw when there's heavy stuff going on. It's just a
Okay.
nice outlet for me. But I also write.
Yeah. So you've written the book, but what kind of writing do you do other than that? Is it all just sort of like journaling, or do you do any fiction, or what is it?
Lately, it's mostly just been like journaling. Actually, I'm working on a second book project now. So I've been jotting stuff down. Like sometimes it comes to me in the middle of a counseling session. I'll like say something, that comes from that space of inspiration and intuition. And I'm like, oh, that was really good.
Hmm.
I can expand on that later. So I kind of have this like long list of things and I already know the chapter outline. So my writing process is completely different in the second book than it was in the first book.
Oh, that's interesting.
First book was definitely more of like tapping into my poetic self, which poetry is, I have like written poetry throughout the years when I feel inspired. But this next book is more like really taking a hard look at the work I've done on myself over the last 2 or 3 years, like specifically.
Hmm.
And I'm like kind of deepening my understanding of it as I work with other people using the wisdom I've kind of gained from it.
Gotcha.
So it'll be a little bit more like self-helpy, a little bit more of like myself put into it.
Hmm.
Whereas like the new prophet, I was able to speak through like this guy who was like my wisest self, through a character, a counselor who was on his deathbed.
Yeah. I want to keep diving in to emotions for a little while. And I think that's great that you connected art and writing to emotions because there is a big connection there. But being a man in our society, just through that lens,
Hmm.
why is the phrase emotional sensitivity loaded or hard to grapple with?
Because well, we have like the whole man up expression, right? Which like
Yeah.
that's usually like quit your whining or your feeling, don't feel sorry for yourself or feel down or sad and just like plow through it, partition off your mind or however you want to put it
Hmm.
and just like move on. And sometimes, there is the time to like let it go and move on or shelf it and revisit it, because if you don't deal with your feelings, they deal with you. Pain demands to be felt.
Hmm.
That's been my experience. And it's going to come like kicking down your door, if you don't pay the bill, essentially.
Yeah.
Now, I did hear something. A client actually said this recently at the treatment center I work at. He said, man up and feel your feelings. And I really like that because I think that's like the message of the emotionally evolved masculine person.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Do you think that as a culture and a society that we've sort of shifted a little bit from that original definition of masculinity?
I think we have a little, because I don't even remember hearing about toxic masculinity like when I was growing up.
Mhm.
Not that I might have been in the circles to hear such a thing, but now it's like, we've had some like clear examples of it in the world around us, and it reflects back to pieces of ourselves that might need like change or growth. And again, I think, and I mentioned this in the book where I'm talking in the excerpt on diversity and collective trauma, about like the age of ego crumbling. And hopefully what I would love to see is like this more emotionally evolved humanity,
Mm.
because I think, like I said, if we're emotionally sensitive and tapped into that stuff, it's a lot harder to hurt people when like you're in touch with your own feelings, because if you hurt them, you hurt you. If you hurt you, you hurt them. A lot of people are walking around unconscious and in denial of this fact, but even logically, if you take a step back, how can that not hurt you if you hurt someone else, and how can hurting you not hurt someone else?
Right. Gosh, that is such a good point. I'm really glad you brought that up. Why do you think people are in denial of that?
I think, and this is another quote from the book, when reality overwhelms the eyes, we find ways to learn not to see.
Mm.
So I think there's a lot of pain out there, and it's too much. And we will practice not looking at it as many ways as we can. And so denial has like four levels in it, according to like Gorski, like by the addiction definition. It's like, level one is the lack of information. Level two is conscious denial. Level three is unconscious denial. Level four is delusion. So what I'm thinking is, hopefully we're moving through to where it's more of just a lack of information. And like if we can start teaching people different things, like our kids,
Mhm.
then we won't be like in the position we're in now, where before it was like, and I didn't live in this period, but I've heard about it a lot, where like what happens in the house stays in the house. And that's come down, that still has continued some, but therapy was like a big problem. Some countries it still is, like they don't even accept mental illness as, a thing.
Mhm.
Whereas really mental health is health. So it's just another health issue like anything else.
Yeah. You mentioned this a little bit, or you alluded to this earlier, that you used to be scared of emotions and run from emotions.
Hmm.
Is it all emotions, or was it just one or some more than others? Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it started with sadness, because when the more like uncovering to discover what's underneath through this like process of integrating negatively charged emotions, which to me is kind of like the experience of like how to be present, how to be a human being and not a human doing. And
Mm.
I find sadness underneath it, and sometimes there's like layers, but like that seems to be like the basis. So there's sadness and fear, which kind of like turns into anger. A lot of times, like it's easy to identify the anger, but what's really underneath it, because it's a secondary feeling.
That's interesting.
So yeah, I think I was scared to feel sad when I was a kid, really scared to. And I think I was sad about stuff because I was really sensitive. And I did become scared of anger too. So fear, sadness, and anger, I was scared of. So those were things I found ways to deny or numb out or quiet or run from.
And were you scared of those emotions just because they were unpleasant to feel, or was there something else behind that?
Yeah, I think they felt so strong. And also, like we were saying, through like the lens of like social conditioning, I felt so weak when I was feeling them,
Mm.
because it's vulnerability. And then if we have life events where we get hurt or in any kind of state of vulnerability, it makes us even more guarded to want to like put ourselves in that position at all. So part of learning how to be with feelings is also being able to identify and choose safe people until you get to a place where like you're comfortable with you no matter what.
Okay, that's a good point. Can you expand on that just a little bit more? Like, what's the importance of choosing safe people until you're at a place where it's okay to venture out?
That's why it's so important that we kind of review our lives, and stuff like 12-step programs are great because I believe through hindsight we develop insight, through insight we develop foresight, so we can choose to change our future that way. So if my storyline is that people are going to screw me over, it's almost like I put myself in positions to be screwed over. It's like almost like I seek out, the psychological phenomena of the confirmation bias
Yes.
parallels with the metaphysical law of attraction, right? So like whatever I'm thinking about or believe, I seek things to confirm that belief on like an unconscious level almost.
Yeah. Okay. So when you were afraid of motions, what were you seeking, even if it wasn't intentional? Like, what did that fear cause to happen in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think I became pretty uncomfortable in my own skin. I think I developed a shame story,
Mm,
which added to, I think that probably is where the discomfort in my own skin came from, really. I thought there was something wrong with me, and I wanted to like shut out those feelings and those thoughts. So when I found alcohol and other drugs, it was a solution to the problem that I had. And it was a way to survive.
mm.
It kind of put out the fire. So it was a gift at the time.
Yeah. You said you found alcohol and drugs to sort of numb the pain. And that, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like a lot of people go through that. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Did you become an addict? Do you have an addiction story? How did that go?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I was like off to the races right away. And I do have addiction in my family, but and I say this all the time, genetic loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger.
Mm,
Doesn't necessarily mean because I have it in my family, I'm going to end up, in active addiction. But based on whatever happens in my life and the way that I react to those things or get supported through those things is definitely a good predictor of if I'm going to land there. So for me, I drank. It was like, how I describe it to some people, like when I was first offered marijuana or weed, whatever you want to call it, THC, I got really excited. Like I already knew innately that this was like something that was going to help me,
mhm.
even though like a couple years before in Dare, like I was like, oh, I'm never going to do something like that. But as
Yeah.
soon as it was accessible, and stuff even happened in those couple of years that probably set me up for it. And I remember I used that, and I drank, and I remember when I drank way too much. Like even like the first time, to where I was having like dry heaves in my friend's driveway. So I kind of went for oblivion, like straight out the gate, which is probably why I got sober so young. But I just wanted to numb and control my feelings. It's all about trying to control things you can't control
Mm.
instead of just learning to be with what is.
At what age did you start using drugs or drinking?
13,
And then what age did you get sober?
22.
Okay. That's really great that you did. What made you decide to get sober? And in other words, I'm looking at this like, what made you stop running from your emotions?
Yeah, yeah. It got to a place when I was 21 where I was probably in like the darkest place I'd ever been psychologically and emotionally. And I almost felt like I was losing my soul,
Mm,
but like something inside of me kind of like reached out from there because all I wanted to be loved. I just wanted to be loved and I wanted to go home. And that was my spiritual awakening when I realized that. And I was like, had been staying up for 4 days or so, 4 or 5 days, using all kinds of drugs. And I thought there was somewhere actually I needed to go to get there because I was pretty much like in psychosis, but at the same time, like having a spiritual awakening, like it changed everything for me,
okay.
which was scary at first because I was like, oh, I can no longer trust my thinking. But I was like, wait a second. Like now I've realized that's such a good thing because my thinking was so deceitful for so long. It was setting me up through all that denial.
Mhm.
So I went to the hospital when I was 21, and that's when I realized I didn't want to use drugs anymore, but I had no idea like what I was up against. So I didn't accept any kind of help and got high that day, got drunk the next day, 2 weeks later went back. Then I was like, okay, I'll do psychiatry and therapy,
Mhm.
but I'm still going to try and control it. Like I wasn't ready to do 12 steps because I knew that's where alcohol went to die. And, this had been this thing like helping me survive for a long time. So I was still trying to find like workarounds.
Okay.
So that was when I fully started to see the trappings of my mind and the way that I rationalized and minimized and, made excuses for everything.
Okay. The making excuses part or like rationalizing still using, that's an interesting thing. I know that like I've had loved ones in the past do these things, and it's really hard to sort of watch and understand. So, why do you think if someone logically knows they want to get help, what is it about addiction that makes a person do that?
To keep going in the addiction,
Mhm.
well, it's like there's this deeply rooted attachment. Like I couldn't picture my life with it, but I couldn't picture my life without it either. So
Mhm.
I'm gonna try to control it in every way, shape, or form. In the AA literature, they talk about how we all have this obsession to eventually be able to control and enjoy our drinking. And some pursue this through the gates of insanity and even death. And the other option is you can accept spiritual help. It's hard to ask for help. A lot of times, people who suffer from addiction are very self sufficient and can get by without help in a lot of areas. But then to admit complete defeat against this substance outside of you, again, as a perceived weakness, is, it's a hard pill to swallow.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about spiritual awakening. And I do want to also talk to you about like the tangible steps you took
Yes.
to stop running and start embracing emotions. But since that spiritual awakening was like the turning point, what was that like? Can you give us more detail into what that involved? And was it different than like religion or how did that go?
Essentially, I had an experience where when I was in the woods, I talked to a Boy Scout that was not there, but was very much there. Not like normal, and I've hallucinated off drugs and even like hallucinated from lack of sleep. And this was like, it's very different. A lot of people think it was either an angel or a spirit guide. And the only thing I remember him saying to me is to get to where you want to go, you have to cross two rivers. Be careful not to stray too far to any side streams or you'll get lost. I thought I physically had to go to that place that day because, again, I was not right in the head. But now I've learned like that's not what the message was. But again, I think it was just recognizing that like I felt homesick even though I had a home. I felt unloved even though there was lots of people that loved me. We hear all the time the opposite of addiction is connection. I was so disconnected. I had abandoned me,
Mm,
and it was finding my way back to that, which I didn't do for a while because I was still trying to control it. I was still trying to process this whole event that happened. My brain was short circuited. I was in the deepest depression of my life. And then, eventually I went to jail. And that's when I started to take tangible steps
okay.
to actually change.
Okay. What happened? Why did you go to jail?
Well, I was selling drugs and the police broke into my apartment and arrested me and saved my life because I don't think I would have gone much longer the way that I was existing. And I was miserable too, really, really miserable, and had been for a long time because I knew like I wasn't living in alignment with the truth of who I am.
Hmm.
It's just so hard to get out of there when you're in it.
Yeah.
So I went to jail and I saw the devastation I'd caused my family, and I saw it clearly for the first time when they looked at me through the glass. I saw their pain and it reflected back to me. And I mentioned this in a previous podcast, like a chink in the armor of ego that allows in the sunlight of the spirit, which is like a flowery quote from, again, the AA literature.
Hmm.
But that's what happened that day. And something inside of me broke and I started to like break down and cry. And pretty soon thereafter, I went to my first AA meeting. I crawled in, whereas when I was 19, I'd been like kicked in and dragged in and pushed in.
Hmm.
But I went in like surrendering this time.
Okay.
So that's where it started for me.
Okay. So, yeah, can you describe the tangible steps that you took?
Yeah. So I started going to 12-step meetings. I went through the 12-step process and kind of implemented it as a design for living, which it's encouraged to do. I went into a 6-month substance abuse treatment program that was in the facility that I was incarcerated in.
Okay.
So that was a good deal. And that was where I found like a really safe person, my therapist, Carl Street, who changed my life by giving me a safe place where I didn't when I didn't have any, and inspired me to become a therapist because the impact that you can have on one person. I talk to him sometimes. He's like, "You did all this, like it is like the person that does it, but to have like the right person there for you to kind of like hold your hand in the process is of paramount importance." And I wanted to be able to do that for other people. I had nowhere else my life was going anyway, and I wasn't planning to take over the world selling drugs or anything like that. And so I decided I wanted to go back to school and study psychology and become an addictions counselor. But also, while I was in jail, I did like 4 levels of anger management. I did a faith based program. I did the recommended aftercare, which was like 10 months. I think I was the only person that completed it.
Okay.
So I did a lot of things.
Yeah.
Pretty much anything that was offered to me. I did a sexual trauma group because I had some abuse when I was a kid that I finally like talked about for the first time with Carl. So I took all the help that was available,
Gotcha.
and I decided maybe everything I know is wrong. Yeah, and I'm just gonna do whatever these people tell me to do and see what happens and kind of let go.
Yeah. Ooh, letting go. Okay. Was it difficult while you were incarcerated to stay on this path because there might have been people around you who were definitely not on it? Or did you find it easier because you had that one safe person? How did that go?
I was definitely in the minority of people that were like even in treatment for the right reason because everyone was trying to get their ticket punched. I mean, I wanted to get my ticket punched too. When I go in front of the judge, I wanted like to be favored, but I also wanted to get better. I found some people though. There was another guy, a volunteer there, Jim. So there's like the 3 wise men that came into my life at the right time, all at the same time that saved my life. And it was Keith, Jim, and Carl. And Carl was my therapist. Keith was another inmate who had been clean before, and he'd already been clean for 2 years because he'd been down the road and been transferred. He was filled with pain and love, which was like the perfect brother that I needed.
Mhm.
And then Jim, he's like a grandfather figure. He taught me so much. He just like loaded with wisdom, World War II vet. Both him and Keith have died sober. And he taught me, if you see a turtle on a fence post, it didn't get there without some help. You can't open a door with a closed fist. Even like he would like kind of tell me I needed more confidence, which would piss me off. And because he was right. But I had so much like false pride still at that time.
Mhm.
He helped a tremendous amount of people. And fortunately I was one of them.
Mm.
So those three were my primary safe people, as well as my family who I talk to on the phone every day.
So I'm hearing you say letting go is important, having a support system is important, and actually wanting to change is very important.
Yeah, yeah, definitely an honest desire to change is huge. Yeah, I mean they say like the 3 indispensable principles of recovery are honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. And every bit of recovery is interwoven with humility. So it's like you have to remain teachable, kind of like the Zen Buddhist principle of like always emptying your mind and keeping it empty.
Mm.
The ideas I had yesterday were actually old ideas, so maybe I need to like be open to something different today. To be flexible. There's so many like helpful things, but again, like until I got to the emotional sobriety part, which was a while because at first I got hit with like all these feelings coming up in waves after getting sober,
Mhm.
and I learned to recover them through other vices, which wasn't so easy when I was in jail. But once I got out and could get in relationships or just sex relationships, or even just like staying busy all the
Mhm.
time to distract myself. Some people it's spending money. I definitely ate a lot more sugar to try and numb out for like the first 7 years of my sobriety. I had like a sugar addiction.
Okay.
So
Oh, yeah.
it took me a long time to like get to the place where it was like, okay, I need to be with my feelings because I can't keep going on the way that I am. Something's got to change. And that's when I found the presence process by Michael Brown, which is all about, like I said earlier, integrating negatively charged emotions.
Okay. What was that author's name again?
Michael Brown. Yeah, it's a 10-week process. But even reading the book would probably be helpful, but it's experiential. I've done it 4 times now.
Okay.
So obviously it was helpful. Anything that I do more than once or read more than once has to have a whole lot of value and be extremely influential for me.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about, you said the word false pride. Can you describe what that is?
Yeah, so false pride is essentially fear. It's, a mask of ego worn by insecurity. Some people say it's like egomaniac with an inferiority complex. Like I have to like prove to people like my worth because deep inside I don't believe it's true
Mm,
because I was still full of shame. There's still a lot of healing that needed to take place, and it was a process of kind of unpacking those boulders. That's what I mean by false pride, just this false sense of self,
okay.
overinflated identity. Sometimes it's the tough guy personality, it's not true. So it's not right sized
Okay.
or humble.
And then I want to know, since your initial spiritual awakening turning point, have you had any other spiritual instances where you've seen a spirit guide or had a message like that?
Nothing like that for sure. But like I said, that was the darkest point in my life. And I think if that day hadn't happened, to tell the truth, like around that time, there was not enough drugs, alcohol, or people to distract me from my emotions anymore. Like I couldn't keep it numb. And I was a drug dealer, so I was thinking about like going and shooting the guy that abused me because I knew where he lived, and that would have been crossing a line that like I don't know if I could have came back from it. So I think, and like it's a wonderful life when it's like, hey, it's George's moment. Let's like send down the guy, Clarence. That was my moment of like wanting to wish I was never born, sort of thing.
Okay.
I love that movie, by the way.
Yeah, it's a good one.
It's amazing.
Thank you for sharing all of this. Let's shift a little bit into the freedom that you experience now that you embrace emotions. What is that like?
I mean, I travel much lighter. The emotions I do feel are more like responses to the present situation. So if I'm angry now, it's like not old anger.
Mm,
Sometimes there still is stuff that I find and I work through as it comes up, but because I've done a lot of that work, I get to be more free in the present moment to experience whatever it is that comes up now. And now that I have like the practice of being with it, which at once I thought was insane to sit with your feelings if they weren't good feelings,
mhm.
I allow it to be, or I shelf it, and then I take it down when I'm in an appropriate space where I can feel it. Because sometimes, it's not a good time to
Yeah.
unload.
You talk about sitting with your feelings. For somebody who doesn't know how to do that, can you explain what that is?
It's almost like, and this might speak to women and men, but definitely probably a lot of men who have been like training themselves not to cry.
Mhm.
But if you're emotionally sensitive, then it happens a lot, and it'll come at you when you're like watching a movie when your guard is down. Like get up to drink a glass of water or something like that, or just like hold your breath and like try not to look at anybody. Which still sometimes I still like will slip back into that, but instead of like getting up to get a glass of water, allowing myself to feel it, it's almost like this guard starts to come up and mindfully like setting it down.
Mm,
And instead of having the single cool Clint Eastwood tear, it might get a little uglier.
gotcha. Okay, thank you. That's a really good explanation that I haven't quite heard before. So I like it.
A good way also, if you're in therapy, like with somebody, or you're doing trauma therapy, especially, like that's going to bring up the old stuff.
Mhm.
So having a safe person to do it with and to help you kind of like co-regulate the feelings because, self-regulation, survival, and co-regulation is connection. And that's what really we need as humans. So finding for that really hard stuff, doing it with somebody, they can't do it for you, but they can be there with you.
Yeah.
And I think even that empathetic connection makes all the difference in the world and allowing you to finally give yourself a chance to be with what was.
Okay. Would you say that fear of judgment sort of hinders that empathetic connection sometimes?
It could. that's why I guess finding safe people is so important. And sometimes that's how I know I'm around a safe person, because I'll just like walk into their office, shut the door, and I'll cry. Like a massage therapist, I've done that before.
I have to.
I had like stuff going on with my dad, or
Yeah.
after he left my mom, and just it was some stuff. But anyway, like I didn't even know it was gonna happen. I went in and
Same.
then I was like, oh, this is a safe person. Cool. With my boss at the treatment center, my supervisor, she's one of those people. When I got the call that my wife had a tumor in her spine and was going to need to go to the emergency room immediately, I went right into her office. That was before she was my boss, and I was just like,
Yeah.
and and like, so when I find those people, I put like a pin in there, and I cherish them, because you need them for like the hard and heavy stuff.
Yeah.
We can't do this thing alone. Nobody can.
Yeah. Can I ask, is your wife okay?
She beat cancer.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, she had Ewing sarcoma, which is extremely rare for adults, even more rare to have in your spine. For every, brain tumors are rare, but spine tumors are 200 times more rare. I learned a whole lot about everything because that's my mind. I want to learn about it too.
Mhm.
But yeah, she had to do a lot of chemo, radiation, and the surgery. And as of last summer, she's been cancer free since then. So
Mm.
it's a really good thing.
Yeah.
We have kids, and
Yeah.
it was heavy.
Yeah.
It was a lot. I didn't realize how much I was carrying it until we did this like into chemo party, and I started to have feelings come up, and I was like, "What feeling? This is like relief that I was having,"
Mm.
and it was like tears of relief.
Yeah. Something subtle that just came out of what you said that I really like is that sometimes when emotions come up, you don't always immediately know what they are.
Hmm.
Like you have to sit and think about it for a minute to know what you're actually feeling. So
Right.
that's a good point.
Yeah, because sometimes you're like, just because you're crying, it's just not always like because you're sad. It might be like just such powerful joy, gratitude, or relief that
Mhm.
you're crying.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're complex.
Yeah.
And then there's satitude, which is an emotion I've made up. Well, I'm sure everybody has it, but that's what I call it. Like when like all of a sudden I see the sunrise, like the sun setting in the clouds when I'm like driving my car, and I get these like tears, and I figure, oh, I'm feeling this like so strongly because I went through so much like pain where I couldn't ever see this stuff.
Mm.
I had my blinders on and living in black and white, and I'm just so grateful that I'm here to have it today. So
Oh,
maybe that's the freedom you get from feeling stuff.
gotcha. Awesome. Let's talk about your book a little bit.
Yeah.
Your book is called The New Prophet. And based on what we've talked about and what I've seen of it, it explores the theme of mindset shifts with a focus on emotion, which is sort of what we've been talking about today. And you've said that your life could sort of be summed up in that theme. Can you describe more of what the book is about for our listeners and just tell us about it?
Yeah. So anyone that's familiar with Khalil Gibran's masterpiece, The Prophet, which was like I think written in 1923, published in 1928. It was like this book about this guy leaving a city, and he was getting on a ship, and he was leaving to get on the ship to go home, and different people from the city pretty much came and like, hey, tell me about this, because they knew this guy was like a sage who had been like observing them, and very deep metaphors and poetic words, the author drops a whole lot of like wisdom about these different aspects of life, marriage, children, prison, sadness, a whole bunch of stuff, buying and selling food and drink. And that was one of the books I have read more than once, and actually studied it with a group of guys and decided that the first book I wrote was going to be inspired by that, and probably just more to do with the stuff that I think about and talk about and have worked through so much, which is emotions and spiritual living and therapy and just all the kind of stuff that I teach on already. And it came to a point where I realized that I think I take some of my wisdom for granted sometimes, and that I could help more people, which I love to do because I see how it changes like the entire world when you help one person.
Mhm.
If I wrote a book. So that's what I did. But my book is instead, it's a counselor on his deathbed with an exchange with his son, and he's telling him about, it starts with being human and perfectionism, addiction, recovery. guilt and shame, trauma, inner child, therapy, spiritual awakening. And I just wrote on all those topics and a whole bunch more. Just followed the pen, saw what came out of me, and made it into a book.
Awesome.
And I've got a lot of good feedback. So people are finding themselves in it. They're feeling seen.
Okay.
There's words being put to their emotions that they couldn't articulate. Some people are having their own emotional experiences when reading it.
Mm-hmm.
Even like one of my machismo guy friends was crying when he was reading it. So it's doing exactly what I wanted it to do, which is like reflecting back to the reader something within themselves.
It takes me back to when you said when you were there in jail and saw the emotions of your family reflected back to you through the glass. It's sort of like full circle almost. I would love for you to read an excerpt of the book. Are you up for that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
So, vulnerability and intimacy. I return to my certain self by sharing my uncertainties. We take off our armor because though it protects us from hurt, we cannot be held while wearing it. Walls come up in relationships. To be vulnerable is to speak your truth, to show up raw and real. We stand naked uncomfortably, letting all eyes fall upon our skin so that we may be comfortable in that very skin we are in. Intimacy. Is there such a thing as too close for comfort? Not between people, if the people are truly comfortable in the skin they're in. That is why some say, "Into me I see." It is the optimal way to take advantage of this house of mirrors we are living in. One school of thought is that everyone we meet in our dreams is really ourselves, a piece of our unconscious mind. To enter a dream lucidly with this understanding, we realize we are all part of the collective consciousness. Do we dream peacefully, or do we toss and turn, terrorized by our unmet selves? So it is when one becomes emotionally intimate with oneself that forgiveness transforms their pain into love, an organic alchemy of the soul. We realize the monsters under our bed are only monsters in our head, and leaving irrational fears behind, we merge energy with those around us. We see the good in our neighbor. We see the God in our lover. We live in spiritual experience synchronized with the world. This is authentic intimacy. This is to feel safe and at home wherever you go. So consider carefully what you feed your mind, as it has a way of infecting your consciousness. Input equals output. This simple equation will keep the doors of your home open and inviting, but be ever vigilant, for it can also bar your doors, locking you in and the world out. Nothing seems safe. This is spiritual homelessness.
Thank you so much for reading that. I loved it. It was really good. And I definitely want you to let our listeners know where they can find all that stuff. But first, do you have anything else coming up? You said you were writing a second book. Do you have any timeline for it yet?
I don't, I mean, this one was I wrote in 7 weeks and I started the whole publishing process because I already knew it was like this whole, it just started happening all at once.
Mhm.
Like I said, this next one's different. I'd like to say a year, but maybe a little bit long, maybe less time. I don't know.
Okay.
So springtime's coming, which is my creative, most creative season. So, that's when I wrote this, and
Okay.
maybe I'll find time to sit. I mean, just making the time to do it.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Well, yeah. So, where can our listeners find you, your book, your services, basically anything and everything?
definitely. So ExcelsiorAddictionServices.com is my counseling business website, which I also have an author page with a link to my Square site if you want to buy a signed copy of my book if you live in the US. So that's one place, Excelsior, EXCELSIOR, addictionservices.com. On Instagram and Facebook, Kevin McNevin Clark. If you just type in Kevin McNevin Clark, author, and McNevin is spelled MACNEVIN. You can find all my stuff on The New Prophet, and once I start posting stuff about the next book, you'll find stuff there about that too.
Okay.
Those are probably the best places. Oh, and thenewprophet.org is another one. And you can also obviously find it on Amazon, which is what most people are going to do anyway.
Okay. Awesome. All of that will be in the show notes. So, guys, make sure you go and check all of that stuff out and go check out this book. And Kevin, thanks so much for coming on the show. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I'm just super grateful that you shared your story with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was awesome.
Subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and learn more at humanamplified.com.